to do that. And I would just like to encourage you to ask Ellen lots of questions, and you know, I'm sure you're going to be fascinated by what she found in her study. So Ellen, the floor is yours, and as I say, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Like Jane said, I recently completed a PhD in information literacy at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, which is the world's northernmost university, far above the Arctic Circle, in a beautiful place called Tromsø. And I defended my PhD in late November, and like Jane said, she was in my dissertation committee. And in Norway, PhD candidates are required to first present a trial lecture before defending their thesis. And the committee decides the title of this trial lecture. Let's see. Yeah. So my title was Barriers and Enablers to Information Literacy Development. What practices are recommended for librarians and other instructors, which I thought was a really exciting topic. So today I'll start by presenting a modified version of this lecture, and I'll connect the barriers and enablers to practice and discuss what practices can best support students' development as information literate people. I'll also discuss my vision for the future of information literacy instruction in higher education. We'll then have 10 minutes. We'll then have 10 minutes for questions and comments before continuing with the second half, where I'll present the tools we developed to measure information literacy in my research, and I'll share some of my research results. And after that, I'd like to have a discussion with all of you to see if we can come up with some improvements or alternatives to the source evaluation measure. So that's the plan. First of all, what do we mean by the terms in the title of the lecture? Barriers and enablers. Also, what hinders students' information literacy development and what facilitates it? And by development, I mean how students learn and change over time. And what exactly is information literacy? Well, one of the challenges with studying and teaching information literacy, which could perhaps be considered a barrier, is that those of us in the field can't really agree on its definition. And without a common definition, it's hard to measure IL in a consistent way, and thereby have a basis for recommending evidence-based teaching practices that work equally well for everyone. So earlier definitions listed concrete skills involved in information literacy, but newer definitions have gradually become more conceptual as the core ideas of IL have evolved. The definition that I've chosen to inform my work combines the concrete with the conceptual. Information literacy encompasses the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed to be able to discover, evaluate, and use information sources effectively and appropriately in order to answer questions, solve problems, create knowledge, and learn. Information literate people are critical thinkers and lifelong learners who can find reliable information and use it to suit their needs, whether at school, at work, when making decisions about their health, or navigating challenges in daily life. IL is often taught in the context of higher education, where barriers and enablers to information literacy development exist at many different levels: the institution, the faculty, the library, and finally, individual students. And surrounding these is society at large. So my goal as an academic librarian is to support students in becoming information literate individuals. So I'll concentrate mostly on the darker rings in this lecture. But I can't resist talking a little bit first about society at large and how this affects students' information literacy and why being information literate is important for everyone, not just students. It's important for those of us in higher education to be aware of societal barriers to information literacy development and how these barriers affect us all. Part of being information literate is being critical to information, discerning between false information, or what some might call fake news, and reliable information. People who don't think critically will be more inclined to believe false information and possibly conspiracy theories, such as that COVID-19 is spread by 5G towers. We need to help our students to become informed citizens by supporting them in becoming critical thinkers and lifelong learners. A new challenge, which has been center stage for the past 12 weeks or so, is artificial intelligence. The release of ChatGPT on November 30th has had and will continue to have enormous consequences for higher education and education in general. It'll impact the way students learn and how we teach and evaluate them. I included here under societal barriers to IL development because it represents an easy way to find answers and write papers, seemingly allowing students to circumvent the important work of finding, evaluating, and correctly using sources. However, as we know, since some of the information that ChatGPT provides is false, and many of its so-called references are fabricated, it's now more important than ever to be information literate and to think critically. It's hard to be information literate without free access to information and freedom of speech. These rights are restricted in countries where censorship is commonplace. But even in so-called democratic countries like the United States, these rights can also be restricted, such as after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, which I wrote about in my master's thesis. And right now, especially in conservative communities. In public libraries and school libraries across the country, books dealing with LGBTQ issues and race are being banned. Librarians are being forced to take them off the shelves. And in some states, librarians are warned not to help their patrons to find information about abortion, and that if they do, they could be fined or jailed. Access to information and freedom of speech are also affected by power structures in society that can influence who and what gets published. The voices of those in the Western world and those who write in English are more commonly published than others, which means that we hear little from Indigenous peoples and from those in previously colonized countries. Our access to digital information is affected by algorithms. Google, Facebook, and others provide us with the information that they think we want, based on our previous searches, our clicks, and on our location. Because of this, we only encounter certain content and perspectives. We're caught inside a so-called filter bubble. So we need to be aware of all of these societal barriers in our interactions with students as we support them on their journeys to become information literate. The one enabler I want to mention at the societal level is the qualifications framework for the European higher education area, which is a common framework for European countries informed by the Bologna process. Nearly all European countries have adopted this framework. It describes what students should learn at the 3 levels of higher education: bachelor, master, and doctorate. Different countries' versions of this framework have compatible learning outcomes, and this ensures that a bachelor's degree in the UK is comparable to a bachelor's degree in Norway, thus promoting cross-border mobility. Learning outcomes in the frameworks provide the basis for learning outcomes in subject curricula in higher education. And importantly, several of these learning outcomes are relevant for information literacy. And here's an example of a relevant learning outcome at the bachelor's level in the Norwegian version of the qualifications framework. After completing the bachelor's level, a student should be able to find, evaluate, and refer to information and scholarly subject matter and present it in a manner that sheds light on the problem. So this brings me to the institutional level. Ideally, the information literacy related learning outcomes from the qualifications frameworks should be adopted by all colleges and universities and included as learning outcomes in subject curricula. If they're excluded, information literacy instruction may not be prioritized, and this represents a barrier. So to better enable students' IL development, universities and colleges should have strategies and policies in place that support the inclusion of IL-related learning outcomes in study programs and curricula. IL is relevant and essential for students in all disciplines in higher education. Academic libraries, which serve the entire institution, are well equipped to take on the responsibility for students' IL instruction, but our services are dependent on support from the institution's leaders. There should be a common understanding at the institutional level of the importance of IL instruction and clear strategies for its implementation, such that all students have some form of IL instruction, whether it's face-to-face or digital. At the next level are the different faculties, departments, and teachers. One barrier at this level is that librarians don't always have much agency or power in conversations about IL with faculty. Faculty members may believe that students either already possess basic IL skills or can easily learn them outside of the classroom. In addition, IL instruction may be disconnected from what the students are learning otherwise. In other words, disciplinary faculty and librarians don't always collaborate as much as we should on the content and timing of our IL instruction. Librarians need to know what topics the students are working on and what their assignments are. IL instruction should come when the students need it most, a just-in-time approach. For example, by teaching search technique when students need to find information sources for an assignment. And again, this approach is dependent upon a collaboration between the librarians and the faculty, so building networks is important. Another challenge at the faculty level is that learning outcomes in curricula, teaching activities, and assessment may not be aligned with each other. When this is the case, it's impossible to know if students have reached the intended learning outcomes. The connection between learning outcomes, teaching activities, and assessment is what's known as constructive alignment. If this alignment is successful, it should be possible to objectively measure whether an outcome, and thus student learning, is achieved. Research on constructive alignment shows that when teachers assess students' assignments for IL-related learning outcomes, this contributes to their IL development. For example, for outcomes related to source use, we need to plan tasks where students can practice citing sources, and their written work needs to be assessed for these skills consistently. With this type of constructive alignment, students' development is boosted. At the level of the library, one barrier is that librarians are not allocated much time for their IL instruction, since schedules are normally filled with more typical disciplinary subjects. Librarians often just get one short time slot for IL instruction during students' first year, so-called one-shot instruction. This is an obvious challenge to providing good support of students' IL development. Embedded IL instruction, where information literacy is integrated throughout a course, would be one way to solve this challenge. With embedded IL instruction, students won't see information literacy as something separate from academic learning. A great example of embedded IL instruction is an intro psychology course that I helped to teach while doing my PhD. The course is flipped classroom, where students watch instructional videos before the weekly seminars. In the seminars, we teachers acted as facilitators while students did exercises so they could practice their newly acquired skills.
Oh.
Students had 3 graded assignments during the semester, all of which involved both using their IL skills and being assessed for them. So not only is this a good example of embedded IL instruction, it's also a nice example of constructive alignment, where learning outcomes relevant to information literacy are included in the course curriculum. Learning activities are designed with these intended learning outcomes in mind, and assignments are assessed in accordance with the learning outcomes as well. So the combination of embedded IL instruction and constructive alignment, as we have in this course, is a very effective way to support students' IL development. Another practice that could increase the amount of total teaching time for librarians is to revisit classes every year, instead of just teaching in the first year. Modeled after Jerome Bruner's spiral curriculum, these revisiting sessions should contain increasingly advanced but related content, a logical progression from simpler to more complex ideas. Each revisit would contribute to better retention and deeper understanding. Some librarians have little pedagogical education. Their teaching may thereby be more informed by trial and error or best practice than on pedagogical theory or the best available research evidence. This gap between theory and practice may be part of the reason that many librarians lack confidence in their teaching skills. To become better educators, pedagogy should have a more prominent place in librarian education, and new jobs for librarians could include a teaching expectation. Another barrier is that many librarians have lecture-based instruction in the classroom, which is a relatively passive teaching method that's less likely to promote deep learning. Research on teaching and learning in general shows that students tend to learn more deeply if they're actively engaged in the learning rather than passively listening. This type of learning is called active learning. Freeman and colleagues performed a highly cited meta-analysis of 158 active learning studies that showed that active learning is far more effective than traditional lecture-based teaching. Students receive better grades and fewer students fail than with traditional teaching methods. Examples of active learning include teachers asking questions to prompt students' curiosity, so-called inquiry-based learning, or encouraging students to discuss topics and interact with each other, or having students solve problems in groups, so-called problem-based learning. On the level of the individual student, one barrier to information literacy development regarding the critical evaluation of sources is a phenomenon known as an echo chamber. Echo chambers are a kind of confirmation bias, where we only seek information that confirms our prior beliefs and values. We don't encounter opposing viewpoints in an echo chamber. We only seek information or opinions that reinforce and reflect the views we already hold. Echo chambers are similar to the filter bubbles that I talked about earlier, as they both limit encounters with differing perspectives. It's important to make students aware of this phenomenon and also aware of Google's and Facebook's algorithms so that students understand the underlying psychological and technological mechanisms that result in the exclusion of differing viewpoints. Students should be encouraged to seek varied perspectives, to critically evaluate conflicting sources, to make balanced judgments and informed decisions, and to argue for their views. When we enter the classroom to teach information literacy, we may encounter students who've never heard of it before, and they might assume beforehand that this session is going to be boring, like what can a librarian teach me that I don't already know? This lack of interest can adversely affect several aspects of their learning. For example, their memory, attention, and motivation. Deeper learning can be achieved by building interest. In order to increase interest, it's useful to study models of interest, such as Heedy and Renninger's four-phase model of interest development. According to this model, interest can be triggered and supported in different ways. For example, if a student has little or no interest in a subject, this interest can be triggered by presenting content that may evoke an emotional response. An example of this is something that I did in my teaching several years ago, when I began sessions by showing a 2-minute fake video of President Obama. The video was created by compiling and manipulating short video clips of Obama with a voiceover by an actor who imitated his voice. In this video, Obama was saying things that he absolutely never would have said otherwise, and that were quite inflammatory. When I told students that the video was fake, they became very curious. Couldn't they trust what they'd just seen with their own eyes? Well, this triggered their interest in learning how to discern between reliable and unreliable sources. Now, in order to maintain this newly triggered interest over time, Heedy and Renninger model suggests that interest's meaningfulness for the learner should be emphasized. So after triggering students' interest in information literacy, we should then underscore why it's meaningful for them to become information literate. This can be done, for example, by talking about the risks of not being information literate, such as believing fake videos or conspiracy theories or unintentionally plagiarizing. Another effect of not being information literate is, of course, that we might not be as well equipped to solve real problems and create new knowledge. Having little opportunity to practice information literacy skills is also a barrier to IL development. We learn skills best by practicing, learning by doing. For example, students will learn to search for sources better by practicing these skills at a computer rather than by just listening to a lecture about how to search. By giving students tasks which require IL skills, first practice exercise and later graded assignments, students will be more likely to develop these skills and to learn better. Metacognition is the ability to reflect upon our own thoughts, and it includes the abilities to assess what we know and how well we're performing. Research has shown that most students have poor metacognition of their IL abilities. A majority of studies regarding students' IL metacognition show that those who know the least about information literacy tend to overestimate their abilities, while those who know the most tend to underestimate them. Now, this is typical of a well-known psychological phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Those with poor metacognition may be at a disadvantage. For example, those who overestimate their ability to critically evaluate information may not put much effort into doing this and may thereby be prone to believing in false information. Poor metacognition can also adversely affect a student's motivation to learn. Why should I put effort into learning something when I already know it? It's therefore best for students to possess good metacognitive abilities. And one way to improve metacognition is by testing. The act of taking a test, such as the information literacy test that we created in my research, has been shown to improve students' awareness of their abilities. In addition to the enablers for supporting IL development that I've just discussed, I'll now take a look at how to find other recommended evidence-based practices. Many librarians and instructors have their own best practices that work well for them, while others perform scientific studies to measure the effects of a particular intervention, for example, flipped classroom. When trying to identify effective teaching practices, it's a good idea to compare many similar studies instead of relying on a few individual studies where results can vary widely. The best way of getting an overview of the results from relevant research is with systematic reviews or meta-analyses. A systematic review answers a specific research question by collecting and summarizing all available empirical evidence on a topic, while a meta-analysis takes this a step further by using statistical analyses to summarize results after doing a systematic review. Now, I found 3 meta-analyses and 1 systematic review that were relevant to IL instruction. Unfortunately, each of these included only a few studies because few published studies fit the author's criteria for inclusion. All 4 articles found that information literacy instruction was more effective than no information literacy instruction. Now, this may sound obvious, but it's always wise to check. In addition, all found that the most common method of teaching information literacy is with traditional face-to-face lectures in the classroom. The systematic review by Phillips and colleagues also examined the effect of other variables besides teaching methods. they found that the degree of collaboration between librarians and faculty provided the strongest indicator of the effectiveness of the instruction, possibly because the librarian connected IL instruction to disciplinary content and scheduled instruction at a time when the students needed it. I want to just mention two barriers with research about the effect of IL instruction. I already mentioned the first, that the criteria for inclusion in reviews and meta-analyses might be so strict that few studies are included. And the second barrier is that researchers use different tools to measure students' IL abilities. For example, different tests or different tasks. This makes the results of different studies difficult to compare. And that was one of the reasons that in my PhD research, I developed a suite of tools, which I'll talk about later, that can be used to measure and compare various aspects of information literacy. Until now, I haven't talked about the last 4 words of the title of this lecture. Are there differences between what librarians can do to support IL development and what other instructors can do? Well, actually, there are. Librarians can help students not just in the classroom, but also in the library. We're there for them in the space where they often work. We can be much more hands-on than teachers in a classroom and can, for example, take them to a computer and show them how to search in a database when they're looking for information. Or we can use so-called nudging, where we try to influence students' information-related behavior by embedding information in their environment, like search tips that pop up when they check out books in the library. Also, we're not as threatening to students as disciplinary faculty may seem to be, since we don't give them grades. Our interactions with students are often more easygoing. We're perceived as available, approachable, and helpful, not dangerous. In fact, many years ago, I worked at a high school where I both taught English and worked in the library. And I loved both positions, but I noticed that my relationships with the students were better when I was a librarian than when I was a teacher. And that's actually part of the reason why I became a librarian. Now, one thing that other faculty can do that librarians can't is to consistently assess students' IL skills in all of their assignments over the course of the study program, and thereby continually reinforce the importance of these skills and help students to maintain them. And finally, my vision for IL instruction in higher education. As I said earlier, the goal with our IL instruction is to support students' development as information literate people. So based on the barriers, enablers, and practices I've now discussed, as well as a good dose of theory and research findings, I believe that some or all of the following elements can be valuable in achieving this goal. Constructive alignment, which aligns learning outcomes, tasks, and assessment. Active learning, which supports deeper learning by engaging students actively in the learning process. Embedded IL instruction, where IL is integrated into course content and learning activities throughout the semester. And of course, collaboration. Collaboration between librarians and disciplinary faculty is necessary for both constructive alignment and embedded instruction, and to ensure that our instruction is as relevant as possible for the students. Collaboration can help us to plan IL instruction so that it comes just in time, right when the students need it, and to tailor our instruction specifically to each group. In order to be most relevant, our instruction should not be generic, one size fits all, but it should be specific to a particular discipline or context. So by using some or all of these practices in our instruction, I believe that we'll be better able to support students on their trajectories toward becoming information literate individuals. And here's my list of references for this lecture. And now we have 10 minutes for discussion. If you guys have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
Yep, we'll take comments in the chat, or you can raise your hand and come on mic. Either way is great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellen. That was absolutely fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what people would like to ask to find out a bit more about. So have we got anybody who'd like to kick us off with questions?
If we have any questions in the chat, could you read them to me, Padma?
We've got some
Lots of lovely comments.
Yeah, comments.
Thanking you. Yeah,
so an interesting comment from Emma, which is it reflects a great deal of the lived experiences for librarians, and it's great to see it presented in an academic study, which I think certainly that's what occurred to me when I was listening to what you said. But we have now got a question from Jodie. Do you want to do the questions, Padma?
Yeah,
sorry,
so it's okay. We've got a question from Jodie saying, how can I encourage academics to engage with me?
Very good question. I've discussed this with Jane. Right. Yeah. Well, the way I do it is I sit down and eat lunch with them, talk to them about information literacy and how important it is, and how we can integrate it into their instruction. That's pretty important, that networking right there. Because like sometimes they don't really believe that it's important. They would rather have all time devoted to their disciplinary topics, right? So we have to sort of convince them how important information literacy is. So talking to them a lot really helps.
Great, thank you. We did have Eleanor, I saw you had your hand up. Did you want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
We've got another question if you don't want to do that yours at the moment, Eleanor. Okay, so we've got another question from Sarah. How do you ensure that IL is embedded in assessment with academics, and how do we begin these conversations?
Right, so we have to be involved very early on when they're making the curriculum with all the learning goals. And again, it helps that the whole institution has learning goals from the European qualifications frameworks also. So we should try to be involved in an early stage and make sure that those information literacy learning outcomes are in there in the course curriculum, and that they have tasks relevant to those learning outcomes, and that they're assessed in those outcomes.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question here. There's a bit of a prelude to it, so I'll read it out. During the pandemic, we had to pivot rapidly to both synchronous and asynchronous online information literacy teaching. Now that we are returning largely to face-to-face, lots of us are trying to keep the best features of online learning. Do you think there are different issues to consider with synchronous versus asynchronous information literacy teaching?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that before. Let's see. Synchronous is obviously an advantage when we can answer questions right then and there, and questions that pop up if something is unclear. It's interesting. I thought while I did, the pandemic happened right in the middle of my research, and I also had a lot of instruction and stuff. And I found that it was really nice to be online. Because we could have these breakout rooms and things, and students got to discuss things with each other. And I thought that worked actually really well. But of course, I prefer to be physically there. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe some others have more thoughts about that. But yeah. I don't know. Does anybody else have any comments? Anything they want to say about that? Any other comments?
We've got quite a lot of other questions as well, actually, coming in, Ellen. I mean, I think what you say makes perfect sense to me, about getting IL into sort of learning outcomes and assessments. Something I noted a few years ago when I moved to being an educational developer was that librarians are often not in the room at the, they're not part of the conversation when course curricula are being drawn up. And if they are in the room, then I find, unfortunately, what they tend to just be reduced to is the person who looks at whether the reading list can be provided by the library, rather than being asked to be more actively involved in the teaching. So I actually remember being in a meeting about a new module that was a sort of it was at a very introductory level for business studies students, and they were talking about how they taught them some of the kind of, they were calling them, study skills, academic skills, and how they built that into the curriculum. And it really actually hadn't occurred to them that they could talk to the library. I think, for many academics, they just weren't, they thought they had to do a lot of it themselves, I think.
Yeah.
So, anyway, it's just,
Yeah.
I think it is about getting a seat at the table, but also to make sure that, academic staff actually do understand what information literacy is, and that librarians are teachers.
So
And
those personal relationships we have with the faculty are really important.
Really important. Yeah. Yeah. Do we want to go to a couple more of the questions, Pamela?
We've got one from Angela here. So it says, I'm interested in your views on how to sell/position IL as a graduate skill and build an IL contribution to initiatives helping students transitioning to employment or further study.
As a graduate school and master's, and is that what you mean? Graduate? I
guess there's either if you're going on, once you've graduated as a selling point, I guess. From once you either graduate and go into employment, or you graduate and carry on into education. I think that's what Angela's saying.
You're right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that information literacy is more important than ever right now. Like I said, because of artificial intelligence, like we really have to be critical to our information sources. We have to look at, I think that most people are eventually going to start using artificial intelligence in one way or another. And they have to know that they have to be critical, because obviously not everything there is correct. And and that the references are absolutely not correct. So I think that could be one entrance into this, sort of one thing we can mention that's new and different, not yet another reason to stress the importance of information literacy. We can use that one. And in fact, tomorrow I'm doing a webinar about just that with our faculty here. Now, so that's important for students at all levels. It's important for everyone. And in the workplace too, obviously.
Thank you, Ellen. We've got another one. Ellen has managed to type her question up here. So she says, just wanted to say that I'm doing postgraduate research on digital literacy skills at the moment. So this was very interesting and so helpful to hear the things I've been reading about and presented in such a cohesive way. It's been inspiring, has sparked quite a few ideas that I need to incorporate into my write-up. So thank you. So I think she was trying to tell you that in person. So
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Eleanor. And then Emma's asked, will your PhD thesis be available to access?
Yes, it is. And I have my last slide has all the links to my articles and my PhD thesis. Yeah, they're all open access. Great. It's only 300 pages. Looks like this.
It's a great read. It's a great read. Padma, I'm not sure if Hazel's question is it more of a question, but I don't know if you want to read that one out, which was at 12:39. I think
sorry, have I missed it?
Came in all at once.
Yeah, I think it was in response to Sarah's question and obviously what Ellen had said.
Yeah.
And Hazel says, I always find it really helpful when I'm trying to engage academics to point to any evidence I have from surveys, for example, module surveys or the National Student Survey, that students have struggled with aspects of searching or IL and would benefit from more support. So yeah, that's great, good evidence and good backup, isn't it?
can I ask a question, Ellen? So thank you so much for the brilliant talk, and I think you put together so many important things, and especially how to put in practice what you are preaching. Just want to focus on the critical aspect. And you mentioned a few times fake news and misinformation. But what we can see is that those groups or people promoting misinformation or working on the propaganda against the pandemic and many other topics, they claim themselves to be very critical against the status quo, against the system, the mainstream media, as they call it. So it's really difficult to operate and to implement this critical aspect into the curriculum, because those people we are trying to fight or to highlight that what they are doing is not really the right thing. They think they are the critical ones. How can we answer or respond to these claims?
We can refer to the scientific literature. Using the scientific theory to do research is probably the best way. Although it's really hard to convince people who believe in conspiracy theories that's wrong and that the science is right. People like Trump really made a horrible thing. He didn't believe in the facts. He didn't believe in science, and so a lot of Americans anyway are on that wavelength. So it's just really hard to combat that kind of thing, like you say. Very, very difficult. But I believe in science, and I wish others would follow the research results. But it's really no way to convince people who are conspiracy theorists. Very hard.
Great, thanks, Ellen. Yeah,
I think can I just come in there as well, Lewis, because I just wanted to, I popped something in the chat as well, and I was chatting about this exact topic with friends last night about, I think with some issues, particularly if you think about something like the war in Ukraine, and the sort of where there is kind of whether you want to call it misinformation or sort of information that's being circulated in certain countries that is saying that what people in Britain or in other countries is not true. It's really, really difficult, and I think this, looking at kind of all the reasons why people believe misinformation, I think sometimes we think that information literacy is the kind of the answer and is going to solve some of these problems, which are actually really big challenges, aren't they, in society? And information literacy can only go so far. It's not, we have got to kind of look at the sort of psychology of misinformation. We have got to look at I went to a fascinating talk about why people believe conspiracy theories, and also how to talk to people who believe conspiracy theories as well. There's some great resources from an organisation in the UK that are called Sense About Science, that it sort of says why people believe it, but kind of how to deal with people who believe that. But I think it's something that is just more and more a life skill actually as well to that we all need. But I can't sort of hand on heart just say, well, if it was all embedded and there was information literacy teaching from when children first went to school, that would solve it, because I don't think it would necessarily. But I don't know if you have the answer of what would either.
I certainly don't have the answer, but I do think it would help to teach children from day one, right? But I don't have an answer. Well,
no.
I think it's good to have the questions.
Yeah. So we've used more than 10 minutes now. Should we go on? We have more time for discussion afterwards. Yeah?
Yep, that's great, Ellen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, please continue. I think that would be great. Yes.
Okay. I now want to present the tools that we developed to measure various aspects of information literacy and some of the findings from my PhD research. So the title of my dissertation is Understanding the Development of Information Literacy in Higher Education, Knowing, Doing, and Feeling. And here's a photo of my team of supervisors who I worked closely with, Tove Dahl, Torstein Log, and Marianne Solberg. So when I say we in this presentation, this is who I mean. My overarching research question was, how do students develop as information literate individuals in higher education? And there were 3 main studies in my research, but I'll only talk about 2 of them today. The first study involved designing and testing instruments to measure information literacy knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which I call knowing, doing, and feeling. In this presentation, all slides having to do with measuring information literacy have a blue background. In the second study, we measured how self-aware students are of their own IL levels and how that motivates them to learn more about information literacy. Although the results here were really interesting, I won't be talking about this today, but you're welcome to read more about it in my dissertation or in the 3rd article. And the final study was the culmination of all the work in my PhD, investigating ways in which undergraduates grow and change as information literate individuals over 3 years. So slides regarding development have a green background. In order to study students' information literacy development, we need valid and reliable ways of measuring their IL abilities. My first research question is therefore, how can we measure students' IL knowledge, skills, and interest in being or becoming information literate? This research question resulted in 2 articles. The first was published in the Journal of Information Literacy, and the second in Frontiers in Education. The first article focused on assessing IL knowledge and skills, knowing and doing. The background for this article was the need for more freely available, reliable, and valid IL measures suitable for higher education to determine what students know about information literacy and what they actually do in assignments to see if they practice what they know when they evaluate and use sources. So for this article, we created, tested, and employed 3 IL measures, 1 for knowledge and 2 for skills. IL knowledge is most objectively measured by testing, and as you know, there are several IL tests available already. Although commercially available tests are controlled for reliability and validity, which are important when designing any kind of measure, they can be quite expensive. Other tests may be free, but they're seldom valid or reliable, or they're often tailored to a particular curriculum or discipline or other local conditions. So I wanted to create a free information literacy test with evidence of reliability and validity that is as universal as possible, and which could perhaps be used as a standard in information literacy research and assessment. To start with, I performed a framework analysis of the IL standards and frameworks that you see here in order to choose one on which to base test questions. Now, you don't have to read all of this. I had 3 criteria. 1, the framework should encompass central facets of information literacy. 2, it should apply to most disciplines in higher education. And 3, it should specify learning outcomes in order to better enable the creation of test questions and to facilitate assessment. Now, all of these frameworks are valuable, but the one that proved the best to suit our needs was the Australian and New Zealand Information Literacy Framework, ANZIL, not to be confused with ANSIL. Based on the ANZIL standards, I designed a multiple choice information literacy test, later dubbed the Tromsø Information Literacy Test, or TILT. I started by generating a pool of 50 questions, each with 4 alternative answers, one of which is most correct. After pilot testing and various statistical analyses, I eliminated several questions that weren't useful and ended up with 21 questions. Now, interestingly, All of these represented source-based aspects of information literacy, finding, evaluating, and using information sources. These facets are often included in various definitions and are considered an integral part of IL by teachers and researchers. So the final 21-item test had sufficient evidence of validity and reliability when we tested it with several hundred respondents. And I then used TILT in the rest of my PhD research. TILT has 7 questions for each of the 3 main facets of information literacy: finding, evaluating, and using sources. And here's an example question regarding the evaluation of sources, so you can use a minute to read this. To assess IL skills, I chose to analyze 2 authentic graded assignments. In this way, I could see what students were actually doing in practice. The group of psychology students that I followed over time had these assignments in their 1st and 6th semesters. The first skill I assessed was students' abilities to select and critically evaluate sources. However, I'm not totally satisfied with this tool, and I'd like to discuss with you afterwards and try to find either a way to improve this tool or perhaps a different way to measure source evaluation. I'll just briefly describe this measure now. In a graded assignment, students selected information sources for their papers and listed source evaluation criteria in an annotated bibliography for why they believed that those sources were reliable academic sources and relevant for their research question. We then rated their annotations and gave students a total score meant to represent their ability to critically evaluate sources. And the score was based both on the quality of the sources they found and on the number of criteria for source evaluation that they listed. And again, we'll talk more about this tool later. To assess their use of sources, we analyzed students' term papers from their 1st semester and their bachelor's theses from their 6th semester. We rated their use of sources on a rubric with these 5 performance criteria. For example, are sources cited in the text when necessary? In this rubric, although I refer to APA style, these criteria can easily be altered to any other reference style. So those were the 3 tools to measure knowing and doing. In my research, which measures knowing, doing, and feeling, we've defined feeling in terms of interest. And measuring this interest was the subject of the 2nd article. In this study, we didn't measure students' interest in information literacy per se, but rather their interest in being or becoming information literate individuals. Now, there's almost no discussion in the literature about the role of interest in information literacy development. And we wanted to do something about that because, as we know, interest is a very important motivator in learning. To measure interest, we created a questionnaire, which we call the Tromsø Interest Questionnaire, or TRIQ. TRIQ items are theoretically grounded in Heedy and Renninger's 4-phase model of interest development. In order to test their model empirically, we created a questionnaire with 6 subscales, each containing 2 to 6 Likert scale items. And here's an example question from the version of TRIQ intended to measure students' interest in being or becoming information literate. We tested TRIQ with multiple samples and several hundred participants, and it showed good evidence of reliability and validity. So after this first study, we now had a suite of 4 tools for measuring IL knowing, doing, and feeling, which I then used in the rest of my research. We call this suite of tools the Tromsø Information Literacy Suite, or TROILS. Now, if you can't remember the name, just think trolls plus oil, since we're in Norway. And we've made these tools freely available online for others to use as well. The final theme of my research was growth. How did students develop as information literate individuals over 3 years? The fourth article in the dissertation is like the grand finale of my PhD research. It was recently accepted for publication in college and research libraries, but it still needs some revisions first. The title of the manuscript is A 3-Year Mixed Methods Study of Undergraduates IL Information Literacy Development, Knowing, Doing, and Feeling. In this paper, transformative learning theory is used as a lens to explore IL learning. Transformative learning involves a change in one's perspective and understanding. It's like a paradigm shift after one has critically reflected on previous experience and assumptions. So there are 2 main research questions in this study. The first is, how do know, do, and feel and their interaction change during undergraduates' first 3 years? To examine this research question, we used the 4 tools we developed and measured knowing, doing, and feeling quantitatively. The second research question was, how do students' perceptions of themselves as information literate people evolve? Does transformative learning occur? And to get more insight into this second research question, we included qualitative methods, namely interviews. Now this figure, which I spent an entire summer making, this represents the quantitative results from the research. It shows development in knowing, doing, and feeling from the first semester on the left to the 6th semester on the right, with numbers for each semester in the tables below. Circle diameters represent mean scores in the percentage correct of the highest possible scores for knowing, as measured by tilt, and for doing, which is the average of the mean scores on the 2 assignment-based measures, and for feeling, as measured by Trick's meaningfulness subscale. So mean scores for know, do, and feel increased significantly over the 3 years. Overlapping areas between circles represent correlations and show how associations between know, do, feel, know, and do, feel changed over time. These overlapping areas are where I believe that the most interesting transformations may take place and where transformative learning may occur. This is where knowledge, skills, and attitudes become integrated, which I believe may represent a deeper kind of learning where students internalize what they learn and that it somehow changes them. Now over to the qualitative results. Both Tilt and Trick had closed-ended questions that did not offer respondents the opportunity to elaborate on their IL development or their identities as information literate people. So to gain insight into students' total IL development, I conducted focus groups and semi-structured individual interviews. My research now involved quantitative and qualitative methods and had become mixed methods. In the focus groups, I asked questions regarding students' development in IL knowing, doing, and feeling. And in individual interviews, we posed additional questions informed by theories of transformative learning based on the definition from Knut Illeris, namely that transformative learning is any learning that implies changes in the identity of the learner. Now, I believe, as do several other researchers, that a deeper kind of learning may occur when a student's knowledge, skills, and attitudes become tightly integrated. I envision the integration of IL knowing, doing, and feeling, combined with some critical reflection, as a braiding of IL learning. In order to exemplify the strands of the braid in this illustration, I've included quotes from interviews. For knowing, when we had IL instruction, I suddenly realized how much I didn't know and have since been trying to learn more. For doing, I've really made a huge leap. Everything from how I read to where I choose to find information to how I evaluate it has changed, evolved. For feeling, after learning about information literacy, I feel more confident when it comes to academics. For critical reflection, I've gradually become more reflective about the things I do. The more assignments I have, the more I realize how important it is that I do them in the correct way and that I think about the sources I've used. I mentioned previously that I use transformative learning theory as a lens to explore IL learning, and I posit that this braiding, this integration, resulted in glimmers of transformative learning in some students. In interviews, some students indicated a change in identity to some extent as a result of becoming more information literate. And according to the definition from ILRIS, this indicates transformative learning. And here's an example quote. I'm not the same person today as I was before. Previously, I was perhaps somewhat less reflective, and I became emotionally engaged a little faster. In order to be considered mixed methods research, quantitative and qualitative results have to be integrated with each other. In the fourth article, I integrated results in a table where the left column contains quantitative results, the middle column contains qualitative results, and the right column contains sample quotes from interviews. And the row shown here is for the meaningfulness of information literacy. And I especially like this quote, referring to the meaningfulness of being information literate in everyday life. Well, at least in this part of the world. So I'll just read you this quote. Regarding avalanche knowledge, I have become very interested in this after coming to Tromsø, and I feel information literacy is extremely relevant for deciding which sources to use for what is reliable. At which point I asked, could this be a matter of life and death? And he said, yes, it could. It's so extreme. So this integration of quantitative and qualitative data was really eye-opening for me and really made me appreciate the value of mixed methods research in information literacy. So those were some of the results from my PhD research, and here are what I consider to be some of the main contributions to the field of information literacy. We now have a suite of freely available psychometrically tested tools to measure what students know, do, and feel in relation to IL. The tools are suitable for use in nearly all disciplines in higher education and in any country. They can be used by both IL teachers and researchers and can perhaps be used as standards in IL research. We've discovered ways in which students' IL knowledge, skills, and interest develop over time. Previous research has focused on just one or maybe two of these, for example, knowledge and/or skills, and very few have done research over 3 years. Although we know that interest is a powerful motivator for learning, the connection between IL learning and interest has not been explored in the literature before now. And lastly, although transformative learning has previously been studied in IL instructors, until now it had not been investigated in students. So here's a list of references that I've used in this presentation. And here's a list of my articles, which I wrote together with my supervisors that are part of my article-based dissertation. And below is a link to my dissertation. All of these are available open access, or they soon will be. So now we have a few minutes left for questions, comments, and a discussion about the source evaluation measure. So maybe we can start with general questions and comments for maybe 5 minutes and then go over to talking about the source evaluation measure. Does that sound okay?
Great. Thank you. That was great, Ellen. Thank you. Emma has got a question here for you in the chat. I noticed that with the TRIQ example question, you specifically used the term information literate. Did you consider students' potential misunderstanding of question meaning? We often find that students aren't aware of what information literacy and similar concepts mean.
Let's see, did you see that in, which slide was that? Was it that the question from Trick? Okay, I think I know what you mean. Yeah. So are you asking like what the difference is between, like if students were confused between the difference between information literacy and what being information literate is, or if they just don't understand the whole term? I think what we try to do is we explain what we mean by information literacy. We give them a definition, we explain what it is. And especially in the assignment-based measures, it's really important that they know exactly what it is we're talking about, so they know how to answer the questions that they're asked in their assignments. So we do go over the definition.
I think that if I can just come in there, Ellen, I think that probably does answer Emma's question then, because I think what she thought, well, I don't know if Emma's got microphone working and wants to comment at all, Emma Brown, but I think from my understanding, I guess I can see what she's saying, that if you just said, do you consider yourselves to be information literate, as a kind of question you ask them cold without a definition, they may not understand it and they might say yes or no because they don't understand the term. But you're really clear that you had already explained to them what that meant,
Right.
in kind of non-jargon way, and giving them a kind of very clear explanation.
Yeah.
So I think personally that you can be fairly confident then that students didn't misunderstand the question and they were able to talk about that.
Yeah, and in the surveys, we always had the definition of information literacy right there. So they knew what we were talking about.
So hopefully, Emma Brown, that's answered your question. Padma, do you want to go back to field the questions? I see we've got another. Yes, she says it has. Yes. Okay. Thanks, Emma. Thank you.
Yep, I'm just checking now.
I think there was one from Susan O'Sullivan that's just come in about the ethics of using students' work and whether your students were willing and aware of being participants at different stages. I don't know, do you want to talk about the kind of ethical considerations of doing research on students briefly, Ellen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And of course, there are major ethical considerations because we did follow students over time and we looked at their assignments and we looked at the survey results and we compared things and yeah, so it was a big question for us, and we did apply to this certain Norwegian organization with our data management plan and all of this. We presented for this Norwegian organization the consent sheet. Yeah, that's what it's called, isn't it? Consent form. Yeah, and so we worked a lot on that consent form to make sure that the students understood. And there it also said that they could pull back, they could stop being involved in this survey whenever, in research, whenever they wanted to. So they were aware of everything we did. And I didn't talk about this, but we did lose a lot of students over time. Of course, when you do longitudinal research like this, you're going to lose a lot of students, and they didn't die. It wasn't because of COVID. They just sort of disappeared, or they didn't want to answer our surveys anymore. But I do believe that we did it ethically correctly as well as we could. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got another question here from Angela. Thinking practically, is Ellen aware of any librarians who are adopting these measures already?
No. I know of some that have talked about using them, the test, and one who talked about using one of the source use rubric. Yeah, but they haven't started yet actually, but they're talking about it. So I'm hoping that some will, because I think that would be really good, because then we could compare results much easier. And also you can modify these if you want to. I mean, they won't be as good for comparison purposes, but you can pick out the questions you want to use or modify them in some way. Although if you're going to use the interest survey trick, it's composed of 6 subscales. Like you can use 1 subscale or 2 subscales or whatever, but just use an entire subscale. Don't take away any of the subscale questions. So if you're going to just use one subscale, use all of the questions in that subscale. Otherwise, we can't guarantee for its validity.
There's a nice comment come in from, well, a couple of people are just saying how inspiring your talk is and how people are very interested in your tools, Ellen. But Hazel's just said that she really wants to look at the tools and also thinks that she ought to be thinking a lot more about how students feel about what you're teaching them. I think it's probably fair to say it's not an area, and I think you picked this up, didn't you, in your work, that, you know, librarians haven't traditionally thought so much about the feeling side. It's much less developed, really. It's much about looking at what they do and what they might know, and actually how they feel. As we can see, if we think about what we were talking about earlier about the kind of whole conspiracy theories and fears about misinformation, actually I think if we can tap into how they feel, that can be a really powerful way to get them to learn.
Yeah, and others have tapped into it by looking at their motivation to learn.
Yes.
So motivation is a typical attitudes kind of thing to look at, but nobody has looked at interest before. So we wanted to do that since it's such a powerful motivator for learning. But yeah, I think, you know, we always talk about information literacy being knowledge, skills, and attitudes. It's three things, you know, but hardly anyone studies the attitudes part.
Yeah.
And it is very hard. This was very difficult research to perform. Not only was it longitudinal over time, trying to follow students over time, it was also three different things, right? Knowledge, skills, and attitudes. It was a lot to keep track of. You should have seen my data files. Yeah.
So do we have any further questions for Ellen at this moment?
Because I would really like to go on and talk about the source evaluation measure, if that's okay.
Go for it. Yes.
I hope that you guys have some good ideas. So I think what I'll do is I'll close this presentation after showing one pretty picture, and I'll go into my browser, try to share that screen. So what are you seeing now? Are you seeing my browser?
Yes, we are.
Ellen, we are, yeah.
Okay, good. So here we see Troyle's Tromsø Information Literacy Suite. And here are the 4 measures. And the one measure that I'm not quite satisfied with is this source evaluation measure. And I wrote here a note from August 2022. The reason that I'm not quite satisfied with this measure is because the scores on this measure did not correlate significantly with the scores on the information knowledge test. In other words, this indicates that it didn't sufficiently discriminate among students with different IL knowledge levels. And it might therefore not be an effective measure of their ability to evaluate sources. And what I suspect is that students that got the higher scores on this measure were the ones who liked to write a lot, not necessarily the ones that were very good at evaluating sources. So I'm wondering if you guys have any suggestions about how to improve this measure or any alternative methods for measuring source evaluation skills. Now, you guys had a link to this earlier. I don't know if any of you actually went in and looked at the measure, but we can take a little look at it. Here it is. So the annotations in the students' bibliographies were analyzed and scored according to the quality of the source that they found and the variety of source evaluation criteria that they wrote down and the frequency of the criteria, which variety and frequency are very similar, but frequency would be more if they mentioned one of these criteria several times. Right, so then we added up the quality, variety, and frequency points for that, and then gave them a score that was meant to represent their ability to critically evaluate sources. When I did this in the first semester, there were sort of okay correlations with their TILT scores, but in the sixth semester, there weren't. So that made me think that maybe this measure was not very effective. So I'm curious if anyone has any comments how we can improve this or how we can measure it otherwise. Now, I don't see you all, if anyone's raising a hand, so maybe Jane and Padma, if you could help me see if anyone has comments.
Yep. At the moment, there's nobody who's raised their hand yet. So if you want to, you can either come on mic or again, you can put it in the chat if you've got suggestions for Ellen.
I could show you an example here. Do you see where it says annotation example? Here's a quote from a student. And this is how we analyzed it. This is the points that we gave. Since it was a good quality source, they got 3 points for that. And since they listed 4 different criteria for source evaluation, they got 1 point for each of those. And then they got 5 points for frequency because they mentioned the relevance criteria twice. So that's basically how we scored them.
So can I ask a question then, Ellen? So is this sort of effectively like some sort of rubric that you've put together?
No, not a rubric. The source use measure was a rubric, but this one is just an annotated bibliography.
Yeah.
So they just wrote, like they had to find 3 sources, information sources, and under there they wrote their criteria for why they believed that was a good source, a good quality source, and relevant to their research question.
So was the marking criteria shared with the students in any way?
Yes, they knew exactly how we were going to mark them.
Okay.
They knew it.
So they saw that it was about quality, variety, frequency.
Yeah, I think pretty sure they did. I can't quite remember. Yeah, I think they did. But again, I still think that it seemed to be almost like those who wrote a lot, like to write a lot, got higher scores than those who didn't like to write a lot. That's kind of my suspicion here. So I'm not totally satisfied with it.
No. There's a couple of comments come in the chat. Jodie's just said that she can't think of a better method at the moment from what you've got. Eleanor has mentioned using the I don't know if you know the CRAP model, the currency, relevance, authority, accuracy and purpose. And they test students on their ability to evaluate sources and give them that as a worksheet to sort of help. So it's just, I guess, wondering what additional help and support students are given to sort of guide them when they're judging good academic sources.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Janice says they use something similar to that that model for social work and education students. Okay. I know there's some discussion in the literature about whether these kind of more sort of checkbox approaches are actually that helpful in some ways, you know, because you know it varies so much on a discipline, and you know what is considered a kind of good source if you just follow these sorts of models is not always going to be true, you know, or you may end up with sources that are actually inaccurate, sort of still coming out supposedly being quite highly rated under one of these sort of evaluations. But obviously you sort of need something, don't you, for students to sort of say.
Yeah, but I also wanted to give them the freedom to come up with their own reasons. So like, here's a list of things that we accepted, but we did not give the students this list here ahead of time.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I wanted them to come up with things themselves. You know, why did you choose this source? Why do you think it's good? Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask what is possibly a really dumb question? I may just not have grasped it from kind of skim reading too quickly. The questions about, you know, for example, whether something is an article, you know, from a peer-reviewed journal, the quality questions, are the students getting the points simply for mentioning that in the annotation, or do you actually go and check that they're correct about that?
I go and check that they're correct. Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
good. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there are 3 things that we look at when we're checking. And here they are. For scoring of the quality of the source, they could get a maximum of 3 points. And if they have all of these 3 criteria, they get the 3 points. So
That's great. I wasn't quite clear whether those points were just for what they said in their evaluation or for whether they were actually being empirically tested against the source itself. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. So these students were all part of a class, a psychology class, and they learned that they learned these 3 points, what we meant by an academic source, or yeah. So they were clear about that.
Great, thank you for your question, Hazel. Thanks, Ellen. Janice has actually added another comment there about using the CRAP model. She said, I do add a feeling type question, asking students whether they would cite a source with an assignment and why or why not. So there is that element of asking around the feelings there. And then Ellen has mentioned that we look at a website, book and journal, so we have given them a few different sources and then ask them to evaluate. We wouldn't necessarily give them with the criteria first, which is interesting.
Right, that would be another way to do it. Yeah. But we wanted to see, you see, what we wanted to do here was to have this as part of an actual authentic assignment that was graded. So that was part of the thing. Like we had to think of some way to measure it, you know, that was really in their assignment. And I don't know if I could think of a good assignment where they actually were told to go into different web pages and evaluate them. Like, would a psychology teacher have an assignment like that? It seems to me more like a librarian kind of assignment rather than a psychology assignment. But I don't know. That, I mean, that's obviously a very good way to do it otherwise, if it didn't have to be part of an authentic assignment.
Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left. There is a couple more questions in here. There's a suggestion from Sinead saying possibly the list could be alluded to an image in image form, and the students tick what they think has been included in the source.
Yeah.
And then Lucy said something to consider around quality measures where learners may be trying to utilize more diverse sources, which therefore may not necessarily fit within the academic source definition, as they could be more community produced. Considering impact of publishing bias, peer review issues, etc. Did you find examples of this?
Ah, good point. Yeah. So like we intentionally avoided using the term peer review. If you see here at point C here, it says the text has been the subject of a thorough professional editorial process and has received constructive criticism before being published, right? So we didn't use the term peer review for exactly that reason, because obviously the peer review process is not perfect. So we tried really to make these quality criteria sensitive to that, yeah. And often students did find different kinds of sources, and we were willing to stretch us a bit, you know. And we had different raters, and we compared our ratings, and inter-rater reliability was good. And yeah, so we tried our best to really rate the quality in a good way.
Great, thank you, Ellen. There are a couple more comments, not so many questions in the chat now, but we've just got a minute left. So I'd like to thank Ellen for today's really interesting talk and discussion and questions, and thank everybody for coming, and thank you for your contribution as well. It's been great to see everybody and great to have everybody's input, and really lovely to hear your work, Ellen. Jane, have you got anything else you'd like to add?
No, just to echo your thanks, Padma. Thanks to everyone for helping to organise this event today, but great to see so many of you here. And if you've got any thoughts or feedback about topics and ideas for future webinars, we're always looking to hear from you, so you can drop a line to us. You will get the slides and the recording from today, but yeah. Just if you could just join me in a round of applause for Ellen now. So that was really fantastic. So thank you, Ellen. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the slides and the recording will be sent out, and you will get an evaluation form in about half an hour as well. So you can put your feedback on there and mention anything, or like Jane says, any suggestions can go on there. So thank you very much, and thank you, Ellen.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just stop the recording, Padma? I don't think it'll let me do it because I didn't.